The alley behind the Gilded Fork was thick with the competing smells of last night's trash and the faint traces of high-end perfume left behind by the restaurant's wealthy patrons. Sophie Green leaned against the cold brick wall, the phone pressed so hard against her ear that it was starting to hurt. Her knuckles were white from gripping the device, a flimsy shield against the harsh words tumbling through the line. "I can't, Trish. I just can't," Sophie whispered, her voice raw and tired, the complete opposite of the professional, upbeat tone she was expected to maintain at work. "He's going to be there with her. I'll just look like the world's biggest failure." A wave of humiliation crashed over her, so intense it felt like a physical chill. She could already picture it: David, her ex, effortlessly handsome in his perfectly tailored suit, and Evelyn, his model-like fiancée, who also happened to be Trish's cousin, hanging on his arm. And then there was Sophie, alone, the discarded ex-girlfriend, still working as a waitress, still single. The thought of it made her stomach turn. With a shaky breath, she ended the call, squeezing her eyes shut for a fleeting moment. She had to put the professional mask back on. She straightened her crisp white apron over her black uniform and forced a smile that felt brittle, as if it could shatter at any second. Inside the quiet elegance of the dining room, she moved with practiced grace, her steps silent on the plush carpet. Her gaze swept the room, landing on the final table of her shift, tucked away in a quiet corner. Liam was a regular. He always came alone. He was dressed casually, in a worn gray sweater and jeans, which was a bit too relaxed for a place like this. Yet, somehow, he never looked out of place. He had a quiet confidence that spoke of authority without needing to demand it. More than that, he was kind. In a world where men with money often ignored her, Liam actually looked at her. His eyes, a piercing shade of green, always held a warmth that took her by surprise. She had, in her mind, decided that he was probably like her, someone on the outside looking in, maybe saving up for a nice meal once in a while. Rich people weren't supposed to be this kind. "Bad day, Sophie?" Liam asked as she approached. His voice was low and smooth, a calm current in her otherwise turbulent sea of anxiety, he noticed. Of course, he did. He always seemed to catch the slight tremor in her hands or the exhaustion hiding behind her smile. The question, simple and sincere, was the crack that broke the dam. The words tumbled out before she could stop them: the wedding, the ex, the beautiful fiancé, the crushing weight of her own perceived failure. She told him everything, her voice barely audible over the distant clink of silverware, her professional composure completely unraveling. He listened without interruption, his gaze never leaving her face. There was no pity in his eyes, only a thoughtful, intense attention. The space between them seemed to charge, like a bubble of shared confidence in the midst of a bustling room. When she finally stopped talking, cheeks flushed with the shame of oversharing, she half expected him to offer a few polite, meaningless words of comfort. Instead, something unexpected happened. A wild, reckless idea sparked in the chaos of her mind. It was insane. It was unprofessional. But it might just be the only thing that could save her. With her hands gripping the edge of the table, she leaned forward. "Liam," she began, her voice quiet, uncertain. "I know this is completely insane. You don't know me." "Not really," she took a shaky breath. "But could you come with me to the wedding? As my husband?" The silence stretched out, unbearable. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. She felt a flush of regret creep up her neck. He was going to laugh, or worse, pity her. She had crossed a line. She had ruined what had been, until now, the one simple pleasant interaction in her otherwise complicated life. But Liam didn't laugh. After what felt like an eternity, the corner of his mouth twitched. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that carried a depth of amusement she couldn't even begin to fathom. His eyes sparkled with an almost dangerous light. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze still locked on hers. "Your husband," he repeated, his voice smooth, full of intrigue. "That is without a doubt the most interesting proposal I've received all year." He leaned forward again, the space between them crackling with an unspoken electricity. I accept. The day of the wedding arrived like a storm front, a mix of dread and unexpected anticipation. Sophie stood in her small apartment, the scent of lavender and chamomile tea, her ritual for calming her nerves, hanging faintly in the air. She smoothed down the fabric of her simple yet elegant navy dress for the 10th time. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was insane. This was the best, worst decision she'd ever made. The sharp, confident knock at the door startled her. Her breath hitched. He was here. When she opened the door, the man standing in her hallway stole the breath from her lungs. This wasn't Liam, her easygoing, casually dressed diner friend. This was a different man entirely. He wore a dark, exquisitely tailored suit that seemed to be spun from midnight and money. The fabric fit his broad shoulders perfectly, hinting at the strength of his frame. His hair was styled neatly, his shoes gleamed with a light of their own, and on his wrist, a watch with a dark, intricate face caught the hallway light, winking at her like a tiny, expensive star. Wow, she breathed, her eyes wide. You really clean up. A slow smile touched his lips, the same one from the restaurant, but now framed by a jawline so sharp it could cut glass. The role of husband has a certain dress code, he said smoothly, his voice a deep rumble that made her heart skip a beat. He offered her his arm, and the fine fabric of his suit felt impossibly smooth beneath her fingers. Shall we, Mrs. Green? The playful title sent a ridiculous, inappropriate shiver down her spine. She took his arm, feeling like she was stepping into a different world entirely. They were a couple, if only for one night, and yet, the weight of his presence felt too real. At the wedding, Liam was a revelation. He wasn't just playing a part. He was inhabiting it. His hand rested possessively on the small of her back, a constant, warm pressure that was both a comfort and a dizzying source of electricity. He navigated the sea of high society guests with effortless grace, introducing himself as Sophie's husband with a charming smile that left everyone, including Sophie, slightly breathless. He would lean in to whisper a witty, cutting observation about a particularly pompous guest, his breath warm against her ear, making her laugh a real, genuine laugh. He kept her wine glass full, anticipated her needs, and every so often, he would look down at her. That look, it was a masterpiece of performance, a gaze so full of adoration it felt like he could see straight into her soul. A treacherous, foolish part of her wished it were real. The effect on her ex, Ryan, was immediate. His handsome face was a mask of confusion and irritation. He kept shooting glances at them across the room, narrowing his eyes on Liam, sizing up a rival. For the first time since their breakup, Sophie felt powerful. She wasn't the girl he left behind. She was the woman who had moved on to someone far more compelling. The illusion was perfect. Too perfect. Later in the evening, as they stood near the towering flower-draped wedding cake, a portly, smiling man with a kind face approached them. Sophie recognized him as Mr. Gable, Patricia's father. What a wonderful celebration, isn't it? Mr. Gable boomed, shaking Liam's hand with enthusiasm. He paused, his brow furrowing as he looked more closely at Liam. You look incredibly familiar. Have we met? I don't believe so, Liam replied smoothly, his smile never faltering. But Mr. Gable's eyes suddenly lit up with recognition. Wait a moment. Vandenberg. You're Theodore Vandenberg. My goodness, what an honor to have you here. I didn't know you were a friend of the family. The room around Sophie seemed to tilt. Her heart dropped into her stomach as the name hit her like a cold, physical blow. It wasn't a common name. It was the name emblazoned in elegant gold script above the entrance of the Gilded Fork. It was the name on her paycheck. It was the name of the vast international restaurant empire she worked for. The world around her spun as she slowly turned to face the man beside her. The man who she had begged to pretend to be her husband. The man she thought was just a kind, regular guy, but who had just revealed himself to be the CEO of the restaurant empire that employed her. Liam's charming smile didn't falter, but there was something in his eyes now, an apology, an acknowledgement of the truth they could no longer ignore. I suppose I may have omitted a few minor details about my day job, he said, his voice low and apologetic, yet full of an odd, restrained amusement. Sophie stood frozen, her mind racing, heart thudding painfully against her ribs. The lie, the charade, the fantasy they had built together, it was shattered in an instant. The next morning, everything felt wrong. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her coffee cup. Her hands, still trembling from the events of the night before, wrapped around the warm mug. The name Vandenberg echoed in her head, growing louder with every passing second. She couldn't escape it. He wasn't just a guy. He wasn't just a regular man who had helped her save face in front of her ex. Liam was Theodore Vandenberg, the billionaire CEO of the entire restaurant empire she worked for. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Patricia, her friend from work. Patricia. Hey, good morning. So glad you could come last night. You looked amazing with Theo. Can't believe I didn't recognize him earlier. We need to grab drinks soon. Face blowing a kiss. Sophie's stomach turned. Theo. The name now felt like a reminder of everything she didn't know about the man who had played her husband for a day. But he wasn't just pretending, was he? He had been playing her, but she realized with a sinking feeling that she had been playing him too. What was their relationship even now? Was it a lie? Or had there been a moment of truth between them, a connection she wasn't prepared to face? The doorbell rang, and her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone. She crept toward the door, her pulse quickening, unsure of what to expect. When she peeked through the peephole, her heart dropped into her stomach. It was Theodore Vandenberg, the man who had just ruined everything with one single truth. She opened the door slowly, her mouth dry. You, she said quietly, almost accusingly. She couldn't hide the confusion and betrayal in her voice. Theodore stood there in his casual clothes, a soft dark Henleyan jeans, but even then, he looked out of place, as if he didn't belong here. He looked at her with a mixture of amusement and apology, holding a tray with 2 large coffees in his hands. I thought we should talk, he said smoothly, his voice calm, almost too calm. He stepped into her small apartment, and she couldn't help but feel the vast difference between their worlds. You thought we should talk, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her anger and confusion bubbling up. You're my boss, Theo. And you let me drag you into that ridiculous charade. You pretended to be my husband, and you didn't say a word about who you actually were. Theodore placed the tray on her kitchen counter, his eyes meeting hers, still calm, still composed, though she could see the cracks forming in his usual cool demeanor. You're right, he said quietly, his voice low. I made a mistake. I've been pretending, but this thing between us, it's real. He took a step closer to her, his presence now more imposing than ever. You think this is funny? Sophie snapped, her voice rising. You think what happened last night was a joke? She laughed bitterly. You tricked me. He exhaled slowly, his hand running through his hair in frustration. No. That's not what I meant. It was a mistake, yes. But pretending to be your husband, he paused, looking almost lost. It was the only way I knew how to get close to you without you rejecting me. Sophie's heart skipped a beat. Get close to her? For what? She swallowed hard, feeling the pressure of the moment. You've been watching me, she asked, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. I have, he confessed, his voice full of something she couldn't quite place. I've watched you for months, Sophie. But it wasn't about playing a part. It was about seeing you. The real you. Not the one you show to the world, not the one that wears that professional mask. His eyes softened for a moment, and for the first time, she saw the vulnerability behind the cold exterior. It was shocking, unsettling. Why didn't you just tell me? She asked, her voice trembling. Why go through all this? He shook his head, stepping closer, but Sophie took a step back. I couldn't. You wouldn't have believed me. I couldn't just drop the bomb on you. I had to make you believe. Believe what? She interrupted, almost laughing in disbelief. That you were just some regular guy? That you were just Theo? He nodded, his expression serious. I wanted you to believe I was more than just my name. I wanted you to see me for me, not for the man everyone thinks I am. Her pulse raced, and her breath became shallow. You didn't think I was enough, did you? You didn't think I could see you. He looked at her for a long moment, and Sophie could see the inner conflict warring in his eyes. I couldn't risk it, he admitted quietly. I've been living in a world where everyone just wants something from me. And when I met you, I thought for once, maybe you wouldn't. Sophie's chest tightened. There was too much emotion in the air, too much honesty she wasn't sure she was ready for. I don't know what to do with all of this, she whispered, feeling overwhelmed. You don't have to do anything, he said softly. But I'm here now. And I want to prove to you that I can be more than just the boss, the CEO. I want to be the man who sees you. The real you. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words sink in. Was this real? Could this be real? Or was she just falling deeper into a lie she had created for herself? The room felt too small. The air felt too thick. And yet, in that moment, it felt like everything had shifted. I didn't want to hurt you, he murmured, his voice rough. I just wanted you to see me. The real me. Sophie swallowed, her heart racing. Could she believe him? Could she ever really know the man standing in front of her? Sophie couldn't breathe. She stood there, in her kitchen, feeling as if the ground beneath her was crumbling. The reality of Theodore's confession, that he had been watching her, observing her from a distance, all for the sake of some fabricated relationship, felt like a jagged shard lodged deep in her chest. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. You've taken this too far, Theo. You can't just sweep in and pretend to be someone else, someone you're not. Theo's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. I never pretended to be anyone else, Sophie. I've always been honest with you, in my own way. He stepped closer, but Sophie instinctively pulled back, as if the physical distance between them was the only thing keeping her grounded. Honest? She let out a bitter laugh. Honest doesn't lie about who they are. Honest doesn't show up pretending to be someone's husband. Honest doesn't, she stopped herself, choking on the words. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Theo's gaze softened, and he took another step forward. Because I was afraid, Sophie. I was afraid that if I told you who I really was, you'd look at me the same way everyone else does, like I'm just the man with money, the man with power. I wanted you to see me for me, not for my last name or my position. His words hung in the air between them, a strange tension that neither of them could escape. She could hear the sincerity in his voice, but something still nagged at her. She couldn't shake the feeling of being manipulated, even if it was unintentional. I didn't ask for any of this, she said, her voice shaking, her heart in her throat. I didn't ask for you to pretend to be something you're not. I didn't ask to be a part of your game. It wasn't a game, Theo said, his voice low and urgent. It wasn't. It was real for me. You were real to me. He moved even closer now, just inches from her, his presence overwhelming, filling the small space between them. And I didn't want to lose that. Sophie met his eyes, searching for the truth in them. She didn't know whether to trust him or run the other way. Every part of her was screaming to run, to protect herself from the confusion, the mess of emotions he had stirred in her. But something inside her, something deep and unshakable, made her stay. You don't get to say that, she said softly, the hurt in her voice cutting through. You don't get to just walk into my life, change everything, and expect me to forgive you because of some confession. She swallowed hard, stepping back, feeling the walls she had carefully built between them starting to fall apart. This isn't a fairy tale, Theo. This is real life, and in real life, people don't lie to each other. Theo's expression hardened, but his voice remained steady. Then let me prove to you that I'm not the man you think I am. Let me show you who I really am. Sophie shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Sophie thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. A hint of regret? A flicker of doubt? It was hard to tell. Then, without another word, he stepped back, giving her space. I understand, he said, his voice softer now, filled with quiet sincerity. I'll leave you alone if that's what you want, Sophie. But know this, I never wanted to hurt you. And if there's any chance for us, any chance at all, I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes for you to trust me. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Sophie stood there, in the stillness of her apartment, alone again. She didn't know what to do with herself. That night, she barely slept. The moments from earlier replayed in her mind like a movie on a loop. His confession. His touch. The way he had looked at her with a mixture of hope and regret. How could he do this to me? She asked herself over and over, but deep down, she knew. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was trying to be with her, the real her. The next morning, Sophie woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing on the kitchen counter. She groggily reached for it, blinking at the screen. It was a message from Theo. She had expected him to retreat, to give her space. But instead, there was a message waiting for her. Theo. I meant what I said. I'll wait. But I also need you to understand that I'm not just the guy you met at work. I'm more than that. If you're willing, I want to prove it to you. Sophie stared at the message, feeling the weight of the decision that was now on her shoulders. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him again? Was there even a chance for them to rebuild this? Whatever this was, the days that followed felt like a blur. Sophie tried to push Theo and his confession to the back of her mind. She threw herself into her work, into her routine, anything to distract herself from the nagging thoughts that kept creeping in. But no matter how many shifts she worked at the Gilded Fork, no matter how many plates she served, she couldn't shake the weight of his words. I'll wait. The phrase echoed in her mind. The more she tried to push it away, the more it seemed to root itself deeper. Was he serious? Could he really wait for her to trust him again? Was she even willing to trust him? It was impossible to ignore the pull between them. Every time she thought about him, about the way he had looked at her with those eyes, that vulnerability, that openness she had never expected from someone like him, something shifted inside her. One evening, while she was wiping down the bar after closing time, she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her looked tired, defeated, and yet there was a hint of something new in her eyes. Something she hadn't seen in herself for a long time, hope. She had been so closed off for so long, unable to trust anyone, especially men. But Theo had changed that, whether she liked it or not. He had peeled back the layers she had spent years building, exposing the parts of her she had kept hidden. And it terrified her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, breaking her out of her thoughts. She picked it up, half expecting it to be another message from Theo. She wasn't prepared for the text that actually appeared on the screen. Theo. I'm in the lobby of your building. Can we talk? Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard from him in days, and now here he was, standing at the door. Her heart raced. Was she ready for this? Could she face him? Before she could respond, another text appeared. Theo. I'll be waiting for you, whenever you're ready. Sophie stood frozen in the middle of the bar, the weight of the decision pressing on her chest. She had never felt more conflicted in her life. Part of her wanted to run, to avoid the conversation, to keep the walls up. But another part of her, the part she had tried so hard to ignore, wanted to see him. Wanted to understand what was happening between them. With a deep breath, she grabbed her coat and headed out the door. When she reached the lobby of her building, she saw him almost immediately. Theo was standing by the elevator, looking every bit the CEO that he was, his presence magnetic even in the casual setting. His eyes met hers the moment she stepped inside, and for a split second, time seemed to stop. "You came," he said, his voice quiet but filled with relief. "I don't know why I did," Sophie replied, her voice shaky but determined. "But I'm here." Theo's lips twitched, the corner of his mouth lifting in the faintest of smiles. "I just want a chance, Sophie. I want a chance to prove that I'm not the man you think I am. That I'm more than the title, more than the expectations people have for me." She looked at him for a long moment, the walls inside her heart still intact, but starting to crack. "You don't get to decide how I feel," she said quietly. "I have to figure this out on my own." "I know," he replied softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't expect anything from you. But I do want to show you that I'm not just some corporate robot, some guy hiding behind a facade. I'm here, Sophie. I'm here for you." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was talking to a CEO or the rich man she had tried so hard to distance herself from. She was talking to Theo. The man who had made her feel seen, truly seen. Without saying another word, Theo stepped closer, and to her surprise, he reached out and gently took her hand in his. The touch was warm, reassuring, but it also made her heart race in a way that she couldn't explain. The moment lingered between them, full of unspoken understanding and raw emotion. "I don't know where this is going, Theo," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. I don't know if I can trust you yet, but I think I owe it to myself to at least try." Theo's grip tightened slightly, not possessively, but with a quiet sense of relief. "That's all I ask. Just a chance." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped inside together. As the elevator ascended, Sophie couldn't help but wonder what would come next. She didn't have all the answers, and she wasn't sure if Theo's promises were enough to erase the doubts swirling in her mind. But one thing was certain, this wasn't over. Not yet. The elevator pinged as it reached her floor, and as they stepped out, Sophie glanced at Theo. For the first time, there was no pretension between them, no games. Just two people, trying to figure out what was real. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust you fully," Sophie said, meeting his eyes one last time before she stepped into her apartment. "But I'm willing to take a step forward." Theo smiled, his expression softening. "That's all I can ask for." With a final glance at him, Sophie closed the door behind her, the weight of the night's decision settling heavily in her chest. As she leaned against the door, she exhaled slowly, unsure of what the future would hold, but knowing one thing for certain, this was only the beginning. The days following their conversation felt like walking on a tightrope. Sophie had opened a door, one she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. Every time Theo reached out, every time he tried to bridge the growing space between them, Sophie found herself questioning her decisions. Was she doing the right thing? Was she allowing herself to be swept up in something she couldn't control? She had told herself she wouldn't get attached. She had told herself that she wouldn't let Theo's world pull her in. But the more time she spent with him, the harder it was to keep her walls intact. She sat at the bar one night, her mind still spinning from their last conversation. The hum of the restaurant around her felt distant, as though she were in a bubble, cut off from the world. She was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Theo walking up until he was standing directly in front of her. "Hey," he said, his voice soft but with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Can we talk?" Sophie looked up at him, her breath catching. There he was again, the man who had both terrified and enchanted her. The CEO, the man with everything, yet the man who somehow saw her. But what did that mean? Was he still playing some kind of game? Or was this the real him? "Sure," she replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. She stood up, stepping away from the bar, needing the space between them, needing to keep some semblance of control. They walked together through the quiet hallways of the Gilded Fork, away from the prying eyes of the staff and guests. Once they were outside, the cool evening air hit her, making her shiver. Theo leaned against the brick wall, his gaze never leaving her. "I need you to understand something, Sophie," he began, his voice steady but with an underlying urgency. "I know I messed up. I know I've put you in a position that's unfair, but I'm not going to keep running from this." "Running from what?" Sophie asked, crossing her arms tightly over her chest, trying to shield herself from more than just the cold. "From me? From the truth?" "From us," he said quietly, looking up at the dark sky. "I've spent so much of my life building walls around my company, around my personal life. I've kept everything compartmentalized, organized. But with you, I don't want to hide anymore. I don't want to keep pretending. This thing between us, it's not some business transaction. It's real." Sophie looked at him, her chest tightening. "And you think I can just forget everything? You think I can just jump into this without any doubts?" He pushed himself off the wall and took a step closer. "No. I don't expect you to just forget. But I do want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. I want to prove it to you. That I'm here for the right reasons. That I'm not the man you think I am." Sophie swallowed, her mind racing. She had heard the words before, from men who said they wanted to change, but their actions never matched their promises. But this was different. She felt it in her gut. The rawness in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes. She had never seen Theo like this before. She took a deep breath. "What do you want me to do, Theo? You're asking me to trust you. To believe in something I'm not sure even exists. This whole thing started with a lie. How do I move past that?" Theo reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently placed it on her arm. "You don't have to move past it. You just have to move forward. With me. I can't promise everything will be perfect, but I can promise that I'll be honest with you from here on out." The words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Sophie's heart raced as she fought with the part of her that wanted to run and the part of her that felt drawn to him, to the truth behind his confession. She looked up at him, the weight of the decision sitting heavy in her chest. "I don't know if I can trust you yet. But I'm willing to try." Theo's eyes softened, a small smile tugging at his lips. "That's all I ask." The sound of a car pulling up interrupted the moment, and both of them turned to see a sleek black sedan idling near the curb. Theo's expression shifted immediately, his demeanor hardening. "I have to go," he said, his voice suddenly businesslike. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Sophie nodded, still processing the whirlwind of emotions that had just passed between them. "Tomorrow." Theo gave her a final look, his eyes lingering on hers for just a moment longer before he turned and walked toward the car. As he slid into the back seat, the door shut behind him with a definitive click, and Sophie was left standing there in the quiet night, her mind swirling with confusion and longing. She wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. She wasn't even sure what the future held. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. The next few days felt like walking through a haze for Sophie. Every time she saw Theo, the weight of what had happened between them seemed to grow heavier, more complicated. They had taken steps forward, yes, but now, she could feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. Her shifts at the Gilded Fork had become a blur of flashing smiles and polite conversation, but nothing felt real anymore. The weight of her feelings for Theo weighed on her, and she couldn't escape the nagging sense that something was off. Theo had been distant recently, his texts shorter, his calls less frequent. When they did speak, it was always business, never personal. It made Sophie question everything again. Was this just a game to him? Had he only been interested in her because she was the challenge? Or had he really meant what he said about wanting to prove himself? One night, as she was walking home from work, she saw a car pull up beside her. Her heart leaped in her chest when she saw it was Theo's sleek black sedan. He stepped out of the car, looking every bit the powerful CEO in his tailored suit. But this time, there was no charm in his smile, no easy confidence. His face was tight, his eyes filled with something Sophie couldn't quite place. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice serious, almost strained. Sophie hesitated, her gut twisting with unease. "About what?" "About what's been going on," he replied, his expression softening a little. "I've been busy, but that's no excuse. I need to explain something to you." Sophie crossed her arms, trying to guard herself against the storm of emotions that was rising inside her. "Theo, if this is about what happened before, about the wedding. I thought we agreed we were moving past it." "This isn't about that," Theo said, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "This is about me, Sophie. About who I am." Her stomach twisted at the intensity in his voice. "What do you mean?" He looked at her with a mixture of vulnerability and guilt. "I've been lying to you. Not just about the wedding. But about my intentions, about why I've been pursuing you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" "I wasn't completely honest with you about my reasons for hiring you at the Gilded Fork," he said quietly, stepping closer. "I had you brought in because I wanted to get closer to you. But I didn't just want a simple fling. I wanted to be part of your life. I thought if I could make you believe in me, if I could make you trust me, maybe we could have something real." Sophie felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. The confession hit her like a punch to the stomach. Was this just another manipulation? Had everything been part of a plan all along? "You're telling me that all of this, everything we've been through, was because of your job?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "That you used me to get close to me?" Theo's face fell. "No. It wasn't like that. I didn't want to use you. I thought if I showed you who I really was, you would see that I wasn't just some businessman playing games." Sophie shook her head, her heart racing with the pain of betrayal. "And yet, here we are. You never really gave me a chance to see who you are. You just told me what you wanted me to believe." He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away, stepping back. "I can't just forgive you for this, Theo. You can't just sweep in and tell me everything was some grand plan. I'm not some piece in your chess game." Theo's eyes softened, his voice quieter. "I didn't want to hurt you, Sophie. I never wanted to hurt you. I know I've made mistakes. But I'm not giving up on this. On us." Sophie paused, her chest tightening with a mixture of anger and something else, something she couldn't quite name. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore. I don't know what you want from me." "I want you," he said, his voice full of raw honesty. "I want you, Sophie. I want to show you that I'm not just the man you think I am. But I need you to be willing to see me. I need you to trust me." Sophie stood there, caught in the whirlwind of her emotions. The rawness in his eyes, the way he spoke, made her heart ache, even as the anger inside her flared. Was this real? Or was it just another carefully constructed plan? "I need time," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I need time to think about everything, to figure out if I can even trust you again." Theo nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand. I'll wait. I've waited this long. I can wait longer." Sophie watched him turn and walk back to the car, the finality of his words hanging in the air. He had put everything on the line, and now it was up to her. But even as the car disappeared into the night, Sophie didn't know what to do with her feelings. She didn't know if she could ever trust him again, but a part of her, a small part, wanted to believe that there was something worth fighting for. The days that followed felt like they dragged on forever. Sophie barely saw Theo, and when she did, he was always just out of reach, like an illusion that she couldn't quite grasp. She hadn't answered his last message, hadn't called him back. She wasn't sure if she was avoiding him or if she was simply trying to find some peace in the chaos of her own mind. Every time she thought about their last conversation, about the way his confession had cracked the walls between them, she felt both the sting of betrayal and the pull of something deeper. Theo had opened up in a way she hadn't expected, but it didn't change the fact that she felt like she had been manipulated, used. But as much as she tried to push him away, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, was he telling the truth? Was there really something real between them, or was she just another project to him? The answer seemed impossible to find. One afternoon, as she was closing up at the Gilded Fork, her thoughts were interrupted by a familiar face. She looked up to find Theo standing in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, his gaze searching the room. He looked different somehow, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. Sophie froze. Her heart raced in her chest. She hadn't expected him to show up. She hadn't expected anything from him, honestly. The walls she had built up over the past few days felt fragile now, as if they were about to collapse at any moment. Theo didn't speak at first. He simply stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. There was something different in the air, something heavier than the tension that had been between them before. "I know you've been avoiding me," he said softly, breaking the silence between them. "And I can't blame you. But I need to see you. I need to tell you that I meant what I said. All of it. I wasn't just playing some game. I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Sophie's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can trust you, Theo. You've lied to me. You've kept so many things from me." Her voice faltered, but she forced herself to continue. "How do I know that you're not just telling me what you think I want to hear?" Theo's expression softened, but there was a quiet intensity behind his eyes. "Because I'm not asking you to trust me immediately. I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can be real. Not just the CEO, not just the guy who owns everything. But me. The guy who wants to be with you." Sophie took a step back, her mind racing with conflicting emotions. She had always prided herself on being independent, on being the woman who didn't need anyone. But the pull she felt toward Theo was undeniable. He had made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before, and that scared her. "I don't know if I can be part of your world, Theo," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not like the women you're used to. I'm not some polished, perfect image. I'm messy. I've made mistakes. I've been broken." Theo stepped closer, closing the space between them. "You think I don't know what it's like to be broken?" His voice was rough, raw, and full of an emotion Sophie couldn't quite name. "I've spent my whole life hiding behind this mask, behind my work. But when I met you, Sophie, I knew there was something real there. Something worth fighting for." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. He had always been so controlled, so composed. But now, she saw something else in him. Something she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. Honesty. And a sincerity that shook her to her core. "I don't know if I can do this," Sophie whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for the edge of the counter. "I don't know if I can trust you again. I don't know if I can forgive you for everything." Theo looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "I'm not asking for forgiveness right now, Sophie. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you who I really am. I can't change the past, but I can control what happens next." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. The vulnerability in his eyes, the raw honesty of his words, made her want to believe him. She could see the man standing before her, the one who had been hiding behind the mask of his wealth and power. She could see the man who had risked everything just to be with her. But was she ready to risk her heart again? She didn't know. "I don't know if I can take that chance," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm ready to trust you again." Theo's eyes flickered with something that Sophie couldn't quite place. "Then I'll wait," he said quietly. "I'll wait until you are. I'm not going anywhere." Sophie stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle into her chest. Part of her wanted to run, to walk away from the uncertainty, from the vulnerability. But another part of her, the part she had tried so hard to suppress, wanted to step forward, to let him in. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. The decision was hers. But it wasn't an easy one. It never had been. When she opened her eyes again, Theo was still standing there, waiting for her. And for the first time, Sophie realized that she wasn't just waiting for him to prove himself. She was waiting for herself to make a choice. A choice to trust, a choice to love, a choice to embrace the unknown. "I'm not sure where this will go," she said quietly, her voice steady but uncertain. "But maybe we can figure it out. Together." Theo's eyes softened, and he nodded slowly. "Together," he echoed. The weeks that followed were nothing like Sophie had imagined. She had made the choice to trust Theo, to take a chance on their relationship. But trust, Sophie soon learned, wasn't a one-time decision. It was something that had to be rebuilt daily, piece by piece, and sometimes, it felt like they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. At first, it seemed like everything was perfect. Theo was there, in a way he had never been before. He was present, attentive, and open, constantly proving that he meant what he had said. He made time for her in his hectic schedule, even when she knew his responsibilities were immense. It wasn't easy. He had commitments, meetings, business trips, a company that relied on his every decision. But for the first time, Sophie felt like she wasn't competing for his attention. But there were moments when she would catch him staring at her, a look in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't the same look from their first few meetings, the playful, teasing glances, but something heavier. He seemed to be watching her, not just with desire, but with something more profound. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was it something else entirely? She wasn't sure, and it unsettled her. One evening, as they sat in the cozy corner of the cafe they frequented, Theo reached across the table, taking her hand in his. The gesture was simple, but it made her heart race. "I know this isn't easy," he began, his voice soft but filled with an intensity that made her sit up straighter. "I know I've hurt you. I know that I've asked a lot from you, and I haven't always given back what you deserve. But I want you to know something." He paused, his eyes locking onto hers with such depth that Sophie felt like she might drown in them. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness right away. I'm asking for your patience. I'm asking for a chance to show you that I'm not just the man I've been in the past. I'm here. I'm all in, Sophie. For you. For us." The words hit her like a freight train. She had heard similar promises from him before, but this time, something felt different. His voice was raw, and the vulnerability in his eyes was impossible to ignore. She didn't know if she was ready to dive back into the deep end with him, but she could feel the pull. She had never been one to take risks, but with Theo, she was starting to realize that maybe, just maybe, it was worth it. "I'm trying, Theo," she said quietly, squeezing his hand. "But there's so much I still don't understand. So much I don't know. About you, about me, about this." Theo's smile softened, but there was an edge to it, as though he understood the unspoken words hanging between them. "We'll figure it out. Together. One day at a time. But I need you to trust me, Sophie. Trust me with your heart." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She wasn't sure how this would end, but she knew that she wasn't willing to walk away without seeing it through. The days after that conversation were both easier and harder. Sophie found herself leaning into the relationship more, trusting him little by little. But there was still that nagging feeling, that sense of uncertainty. Theo wasn't the only one who had been hiding parts of himself. Sophie, too, had built walls. She had her own history, her own fears, and as much as she wanted to believe in their future, she couldn't ignore the scars from her past. Then came the phone call. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. right as Sophie was getting off her shift. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find Patricia's name flashing on the screen. "Hello?" Sophie answered, feeling an uneasy tightness in her chest. "Sophie," Patricia's voice was urgent, "you need to come to the office. It's about Theo. There's something you need to know." The words hit Sophie like a slap to the face. What about Theo? What could be so urgent that Patricia needed her to come to the office? Sophie's heart raced as she quickly told her boss she was leaving. She grabbed her bag and rushed out, her mind whirling with possibilities. What could this be about? When she arrived at the Gilded Fork, the air in the office felt thick with tension. Patricia was sitting at her desk, looking unusually serious, her eyes glued to the screen of her laptop. "What's going on?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice steady, but her hands trembled at her sides. Patricia didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the laptop around so Sophie could see it was an article. A news piece. The Vandenberg Empire was under scrutiny for corporate misconduct. Allegations of insider trading, fraud, and mismanagement were being investigated by federal authorities. Sophie felt her stomach lurch. "Theo," she whispered. Patricia nodded grimly. "It's all over the news. His company could be in serious trouble. And he's at the center of it." Sophie sat down in the nearest chair, her mind spinning. She had just started to trust Theo again, to believe that there was something real between them. And now, the world she had so carefully stepped into was falling apart in front of her eyes. As the days went by, the scandal only deepened. Theo's face appeared on every news channel, every magazine. The man who had once seemed invincible was now being torn apart by the very empire he had built. Sophie didn't know what to think. Was this the Theo she had trusted? Was this the man she had been falling in love with? Or was he just another businessman caught in the web of his own lies? But even in the chaos, one thing was clear: Sophie was still there. She hadn't walked away. And neither had Theo. Theo came to her that night, his expression heavy with the weight of the situation. "I know what's happening. I know this is everything you've been afraid of, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not asking for that." Sophie looked at him, her heart in her throat. "I'm not sure if I can be a part of this," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can be with you through all of this." Theo stepped closer, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't want to drag you into my mess, Sophie. But I can't do this without you. You're the only person who's made me feel like I can be more than just a CEO. You're the one I want to be with." Sophie took a deep breath. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if they would make it through this storm together. But one thing was certain: she couldn't walk away from him, she wasn't ready to let him go. The days following the scandal felt like a whirlwind. Sophie barely had time to process the full extent of the allegations against Theo before the storm around him escalated. The media frenzy was relentless, every day bringing new reports of corporate fraud and insider trading. The Vandenberg Empire, the company Theo had built from the ground up, was crumbling, and with it, the life he had worked so hard to protect. Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation press down on her chest. She had tried to stay away from the headlines, to focus on her own life and her fragile relationship with Theo. But every time she turned on the news, every time she saw his face plastered across the screen, it felt like she was drowning in it all. She had promised him that she wouldn't walk away, that she would give him the chance to prove himself. But now, as the weeks passed and the scandal only grew bigger, Sophie found herself wondering if she had made a mistake. Theo, for his part, was barely holding it together. His once confident, composed demeanor had shattered. He was no longer the man who charmed her with his quiet confidence and powerful presence. He was just a man struggling to keep everything from falling apart. One evening, Sophie arrived at the Gilded Fork for her shift, her mind a mess of thoughts and emotions. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, maybe a break, a reprieve from the chaos that had consumed her life. But when she stepped inside, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with the tension of a staff that seemed to be waiting for something to happen. It wasn't long before she saw Theo standing near the back of the restaurant. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, and his face was drawn with exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Sophie," he said when he saw her, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't sure what she was expecting from him anymore. The man who had once been her confidant, her partner, now felt like a stranger in a way. The distance between them had grown, and Sophie wasn't sure how to bridge it. "I can't keep doing this, Theo," Sophie said, her voice low and filled with frustration. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay. I don't know who you are anymore." Theo's expression softened, and he stepped closer, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't place. "I'm sorry, Sophie," he said quietly. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I never wanted you to be caught up in this mess." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You don't get it. I don't care about the company. I don't care about all the money or the power. What I care about is you. The person I thought you were." "I am still that person," Theo said urgently, his voice rising slightly. "I'm still the man who loves you. I never meant for any of this to hurt you." Sophie stepped back, shaking her head again. "But it has hurt me, Theo. All the lies, all the secrets. The way you've kept so much from me. I don't know how to move past that." Theo reached out, but she pulled away, feeling the sting of his touch as if it were a brand. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm asking you to forgive me. And if you can't, then I understand. But I need you to know that I've never loved anyone like I love you, Sophie." Her breath caught in her throat. He had said it before, but now, with everything falling apart around them, the words carried more weight. She didn't know if she could forgive him, not yet. The betrayal still stung, still cut deep. "I don't know if I can do this, Theo," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can keep fighting for something that feels like it's slipping away." Theo's face softened, the lines of stress and exhaustion evident in his features. "Then I'll wait, Sophie. I'll wait for as long as it takes for you to decide what you want. But please know, I will never stop fighting for us." She closed her eyes, taking in his words, but the doubt remained. Could she trust him again? Could she rebuild the fragile foundation they had started to build together? "I need time," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to figure out what I want, what we want." Theo nodded slowly, his face full of resignation. "I understand," he said quietly, stepping back. "I'll give you the space you need. But know this, Sophie, I'll be here when you're ready. I'll never give up on us." Sophie watched as he walked away, his figure retreating into the shadows of the restaurant. She stood there for a long moment, her heart torn between the man she loved and the man who had hurt her. The choice she had to make felt heavier than ever. The next few days were agonizing for Sophie. The tension between them lingered, but she couldn't bring herself to fully close the door on Theo. The feelings she had for him hadn't disappeared, but the betrayal, the lies, they haunted her, making it hard to trust him again. Then came the call. It was late one night when her phone rang. She glanced at the screen to see Theo's name flashing on the display. She hesitated before answering. "Sophie," Theo's voice was urgent, desperate. "I need to see you. Please." Her heart skipped a beat. "Theo, what's going on?" "I don't have much time," he said quickly. "But I need to tell you something. Something that will change everything." Sophie's heart raced as she walked through the quiet streets of the city, headed toward the place where she had agreed to meet Theo. The air was cold, but it wasn't the chill that made her shiver. It was the uncertainty that gripped her chest, the nagging doubt that had been growing with every passing day. She didn't know what to expect. She didn't know what Theo was going to say, but she knew one thing for sure: it would be the final test. When she arrived at the small park near the river, the place where they had shared so many quiet moments, she saw him waiting for her. His hands were in his pockets, his posture rigid, as though he was bracing himself for something. He looked so different than the man she had met months ago. The man who had been confident, assured, and strong was now fragile, vulnerable. His eyes, though filled with the same depth, were heavy with an unspoken burden. Theo turned to face her as she approached, his expression unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the words that were about to come. Sophie stood there, her heart in her throat, her breath caught in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever he was about to say, but she had promised herself that she would listen. Sophie, Theo began, his voice low and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. I need you to understand something. Something I should have told you a long time ago. She held her breath. What is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Theo exhaled slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted any of this to happen. But there's something about my past, something I've kept hidden for so long, that I can't keep from you anymore. Sophie frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. What are you talking about? Theo took a deep breath, his shoulders tense. Before everything happened, before the scandal broke, there was something I did. Something I thought was behind me. But it's not. And now, I need you to know the truth. Sophie felt the weight of his words settle in, but she couldn't fully grasp what he was trying to say. Her heart was pounding, and she could feel her palms begin to sweat. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head slightly. What do you mean? What are you hiding from me, Theo? He looked away, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. I was involved in something illegal. A long time ago. Something I thought I could leave behind, something I thought was over. But when the investigation into the company started, they dug up things I never thought would come back. They found my name in some old documents. Sophie's stomach dropped. The words felt like a slap to the face. What are you saying? She asked, her voice trembling now. Are you telling me that you've been lying to me from the very beginning? That everything you told me about who you were, was a lie? Theo looked at her, his eyes filled with the kind of raw vulnerability Sophie had never seen before. No. It wasn't a lie, Sophie. I didn't lie about me. I lied about the things I've done, the things I've been a part of. I kept it from you because I didn't want you to see me as the man I used to be. I didn't want you to know the things I've done, the mistakes I've made. Sophie's mind spun, the world around her suddenly feeling far too heavy. She had thought she knew who Theo was, had believed in the man he had shown her. But now, with his confession hanging in the air between them, she realized how little she truly knew. So you've been hiding this from me all along, she whispered, her heart breaking with every word. You've been pretending to be someone you're not? You've been lying to me, and you think I'm just supposed to forgive you? Theo's face twisted with pain. I didn't want to lie to you. I never meant for this to happen, but I had no choice. If I had told you the truth from the beginning, I would have lost you. I would have lost everything. But now, it's all coming back. And I can't protect you from it anymore. Sophie took a step back, her mind whirling with confusion, anger, and betrayal. You should have told me, she said through clenched teeth. You should have told me the truth from the start. You should have trusted me. Theo's eyes softened, and he stepped toward her, but Sophie held up her hand, stopping him. Don't. Don't come any closer. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Sophie. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant for you to find out like this. Sophie's eyes welled with tears, but she fought them back. She had promised herself she would be strong. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall for the same lies again. But this time, it felt different. The raw honesty in Theo's voice, the pain in his eyes, it all felt too real, too raw. I don't know what to believe anymore, Sophie said, her voice breaking. I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything. Not after all the lies. Theo stood there, his face etched with regret. I can't change the past, Sophie. But I want to prove to you that I can be the man you deserve. That I'm not the man I used to be. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to show you who I really am. Sophie looked at him, her heart torn between love and betrayal, between wanting to believe in him and the fear of being hurt again. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive him, to accept the man he had been. But she knew one thing, the choice wasn't just his to make. It was hers. I need time, Sophie said, her voice trembling with emotion. I need time to figure this out. I need to decide if I can trust you again. Theo nodded, his face falling. I'll wait. I'll wait as long as it takes. Sophie turned and walked away, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a small glimmer of hope. She wasn't sure if Theo could change, if they could make it through this storm. But she knew that the choice was hers to make. And maybe, just maybe, she could give him the chance he was asking for. The following days felt like a blur to Sophie. The weight of Theo's confession hung over her, pressing down on her chest, and the uncertainty of the future gnawed at her every waking moment. She didn't know what to believe anymore, didn't know if she could ever trust Theo again. The scandal had ripped through his life, and now, his past had come to the forefront in a way that was impossible to ignore. The lies, the secrets, the things he had hidden, they all came crashing down in front of her, forcing her to face the truth she had tried so hard to avoid. She hadn't seen Theo since their conversation in the park. He had given her space, as he promised, but the distance between them felt suffocating. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, saw the raw emotion in his eyes as he begged her for a chance, but could she really forgive him? Sophie spent days in solitude, replaying the moments they had shared, trying to make sense of it all. She thought about the man she had fallen for, the man who had shown her kindness, who had made her feel seen in a way she had never felt before. But she also thought about the man who had lied, who had kept secrets from her, who had used her for his own purposes. Was it worth it? Could she move past the betrayal? Or was she just setting herself up to be hurt again? The decision was not an easy one. It weighed on her every moment, consuming her thoughts until she could barely focus on anything else. But as the days dragged on, she realized one thing, she couldn't keep running from this. She couldn't keep pretending that she didn't care. Theo had given her the space she needed, but now, Sophie had to make the choice herself. She couldn't wait any longer. One evening, after her shift, she found herself standing outside the Gilded Fork again, the crisp night air biting at her skin. She didn't know why she had come here, but it felt like the only place where she could make sense of it all. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Theo. Theo. I'm at the park. I'm waiting for you. Whenever you're ready. Her heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this moment, but now that it was here, she felt the weight of it pressing down on her. She didn't reply. Instead, she just started walking. When she reached the park, she found Theo sitting on the same bench they had shared so many months ago. His posture was tense, his face a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He looked up when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly. Sophie, he said, standing up quickly. You came. I came, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. But I still don't know if I'm ready for this. For you. Theo's face tightened, but he didn't look away. I understand, he said softly. I never wanted to put you in this position. But I've been waiting for you. Waiting for you to decide what you want, what you need. Sophie stood there for a long moment, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She looked at Theo, really looked at him. The man who had been a stranger to her in the beginning, the man who had become so much more. The man who had lied to her, but who had also shown her a side of him she hadn't expected. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him again? She didn't have all the answers, and maybe she never would. But one thing was certain, she couldn't walk away from the love they had shared. She couldn't walk away from what they could still have, if they were willing to fight for it. I don't know if I can trust you again, Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know if I can forget the lies, the secrets. But I know this, I can't walk away. Not yet. Theo's eyes softened, and he stepped closer. Sophie, I'll spend every day proving to you that I'm worthy of your trust. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you. But I love you. I love you more than anything, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn your forgiveness. Sophie took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she was willing to try. She was willing to take that first step toward trusting him again, toward building something real, despite the fear and uncertainty. I'm willing to try too, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Theo reached for her, his hand trembling slightly, and for the first time in weeks, Sophie didn't pull away. Instead, she let him take her hand, feeling the warmth of his touch as he pulled her closer. I'll be here, Theo said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I'll be here every step of the way. Sophie looked up at him, her heart still uncertain but full of a hope she hadn't felt in so long. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and times when the past would threaten to pull them apart. But for now, in this moment, she was ready to try. Ready to take that leap of faith. As weeks turned into months, Sophie and Theo faced their challenges, one day at a time. Trust wasn't built overnight, but each day they spent together, they found a way to heal the wounds of the past. Theo worked to rebuild his company and regain the trust of the people who had once believed in him. And Sophie, slowly but surely, let herself believe in him again. In the end, they learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding, patience, and the willingness to move forward, even when the past tried to hold them back. Together, they found a future, one built on trust, love, and the strength to overcome anything.